Lynne, thank you so much for joining us again on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast. Great to see you.
It's great to be here.
So maybe we should just start with how did you come to write Memorycraft, a follow-up to the memory code?
Right, it is a completely independent book, but what happened with the memory code, which looked at memory techniques of Indigenous cultures and how they applied to the archaeology interpretation, the reaction to the book was overwhelmingly, how can we put these memory methods into effect in everyday life?
Right.
Hence, Memory Craft became the how to craft, the how to practical book. But you don't have to read memory code first.
Right. Although I do highly recommend it. And one
Thank
of the
you.
things that's so important in Memorycraft to me as an enthusiast, but I think to anybody, is the depth and the richness of this tradition throughout international history.
Absolutely. Uh, a lot of people talk about these methods going back to the ancient Greeks. They long predate them and are used universally because they match the way the brain works. And that's what's been a big difference for me in working on Memorycraft and since Memory Code is that I've been working with neuroscientist Dr. Jenny Roger at the University of Western Australia, and the match between the recent neuroscience on plasticity, which is her field of expertise, and these memory methods is just so close, which is totally logical.
Right, right. Well, one of the things that jumped out at me with the neuroscience that you mentioned uh, is this idea that our brains are taking snapshots of things. And the first thing that I thought of was, a little challenge I'm doing for myself is to use really noisy highways as memory palaces. And it always seems like a distraction. And I think back to some of the, medieval writings and the ancient Greek writings where they, talk about quiet places and so forth. And I wonder if they were anticipating highways because it seems like there's an interference, even though in my mind the highway's quiet. My brain has taken a snapshot, so to speak, of it being noisy. Does that gel with what you've been discovering in the neuroscience?
Yeah.
And
Noise will certainly interfere because you need your brain to focus. And I wonder if that's why so many shops have music and noise and things going on, because it stops you focusing and being reasonable about, do I really want to spend this much money?
right.
I'm concerned about the level of noise. So I think it definitely interferes with it. But if your experiments show otherwise, I'd be surprised.
Well, no, they don't show otherwise, but I've done it as a way of upping the challenge for myself
Ah,
and personal experiments. And it's, to be honest, it's not worth the additional effort at the end of the day, but it is that sort of, making things more challenging, having a certain growth effect overall. But it's just when I read about this snapshot effect that the brain may be making, I was like, oh, maybe that's why this noise is interfering. But you yourself talk about having streets and outdoor locations as memory palaces in your journeys. Are they all quiet by choice, or do you ever have noisier locations?
I haven't thought about it. I've got about 10 kilometres of Memory Palace now mapped out around Castlemaine, but I live in Castlemaine, a country town.
Right.
But now that, but some of it is along the highway, and I just don't notice the noise. That's one thing I've found in since I've been doing this memory training is my ability to focus is so much better than it ever was before. Even when I'm just doing ordinary things, I have the capability now of excluding interfering thoughts when I want to focus. And that's one thing I learnt with the memory training for the competitions is the first thing, I'd be memorizing a deck of cards and suddenly I'll be thinking, have I taken something out of the freezer for dinner and things like that. Once I started the training, I learnt to block that stuff. So now that I think of it, I do have noisy roads and things, but when I'm concentrating on the memory palaces, I just don't notice it.
Right.
I hadn't thought about that.
I technically don't notice it either, but it seems like they're harder to use. And I wondered if it's because of the encoding of it, my brain knows it's a noisy highway, so maybe it seemed odd to me that it would be an additional level of challenge. Um,
But our highway up here,
yeah,
level of noise is not high at all.
right.
And I'm walking, I've got time. I don't rush things. And that's what St. Augustine and a lot of the other memory people talk about meditating. They're
Mm,
not sitting cross legged,
right.
emptying their minds, they're concentrating on their memory palaces and the images and stories. So when I'm walking, I do take time. My longest memory palace is 5 kilometers for the radicals, for the Chinese characters.
Right.
So as I walk past each house, I've got time for a truck to go past and be gone, and I'm still at that same location.
Right. About Chinese, now that you mention it, I wanted to sort of tie a question about Chinese to maybe a Mephistophelian gambit in that you mention in the book, which is, I don't know if you've come across it yet, but my wife is often at the computer and she says, what is it? 我要多少? Have you ever come across that phrase?
No,
It means
I'm Chinese is I'm just getting into,
right,
and although I recognise Warshao, um, because I took on French, my worst subjects at school by so far were languages because my memory is naturally so bad. And uh, so when the readers of Memory Code kept talking about how would we use these methods for languages, I kept resisting, but eventually I had to give in. So I went back to French, which I did at school and couldn't remember anything except the odd word,
right,
and found using the memory methods was a completely different world.
right,
So I decided to take on a bigger challenge and take on Chinese.
right.
But I've got absolutely hooked on the continuation of the characters because it's the only language which you can find right from the pre-literate times, right from the early symbols and the development of all the characters right through. And they use art forms for memory, the memory,
Mm.
great long scrolls and things. So I've got absolutely hooked on ancient Chinese art and the development of the characters more than the speaking of it.
Well, you
So
mentioned
not very
mem-
good at it yet.
oh,
So
oh,
back to your wife's
I
comment.
wasn't meaning to test your Chinese, but rather if you just come across that phrase, because she sits there at the computer and she's looking at pots and pans, and she says, "I have to cut my hand off." Right? That's what that means. 我要剁手 means I should cut my hand off. And I was relating that a little bit to this moment in the book where you talk about how it's almost, to me, it seems like a Faust moment or a Mephistophelian moment where you just get more in your memory and you want more and then you want more and more and more, and it's like this self-interfering kind of magical stunt that you can perform.
People look at these methods and say, but actually you're having to remember more.
Mm,
But it just doesn't feel like that because once I've got a memory palace set down, like for all the radicals of the Chinese, I then have hooks for everything.
right,
For all the countries of the world, all of prehistory and history, I have hooks for everything. And therefore I want to add more and more. But because I'm doing 35 different experiments and taken on a huge range of topics in order to test the methods, I get to the stage sometimes my brain just wants everything now. Uh, Life is so much more dynamic and
mm,
alive.
yeah.
So your landscape and your world is filled with all these hooks.
Well, how you mentioned concentration already, but given that temptation, which I feel myself, and I think many people who get into memory techniques, they start to feel that curiosity grows,
Exactly.
lust for life grows, or the life of information. How do you then choose? What's your daily process for actually getting some focus when you really feel like you could have it all if there was enough time to do it all?
I do try and choose something each day. So if I'm going away on a little trip with my husband, who's a fanatical birder, then I concentrate on the birds.
Right.
Uh, because I'm at the stage with the birds of layering. So I've got a complete list of the 412. There's actually more than that, adding in all the vagrants and other things. So we've got 430 or so birds for Victoria. In my head, I'm now layering how we tell them apart and looking at the behaviour according, because I've got them all in families, scientific families, all that sort of thing. And we talk about that. So every morning when we do our 5K morning walk and then to the shops to get lunch, fresh lunch, I choose a topic. And if I'm walking with him, I'll choose a topic that interests him. Countries of the world interests him, history, the 130 ancestors, which we'll get to at some stage, really has caused a bigger reaction than I expected, and the birds. They're the main ones I'll do on the morning walks.
Right.
And then it just depends what I can calm my brain to focus on at any time.
Right. Well, your husband plays quite a role in the book. He's a recurring character, so to speak. And so maybe talk a little bit about how you incorporate this with your family and how important that is to have someone who shares a basic interest with what you're doing. And are there any tips for other people who, I hear from people all the time who they have to convince their spouse or their family member that this even makes sense to spend time on, let alone actual sense in terms of buying books and stuff. So
I think the big issue for me was not setting aside time for it, but incorporating it into everyday life. So I did set time aside for training for the memory competitions.
Right.
But most of my work is memorizing for normal stuff. So I have little bits of paper or lists or whatever whenever I'm walking, cooking, gardening, showering, getting dressed in the morning. All of those are times which are basically brain dead.
Right.
In that you're doing something that doesn't require a lot of concentration. So I cook in French with my two characters, and we must get to characters because that's what's been a big revelation for me. I cook in French, I shop in French, not good French, but I shop in French. And so lots of times of the day I set aside for this sort of thing, depending on what I'm doing. So I've incorporated into everyday life. So with my husband, I do the ones that particularly interest him. With the grandchildren, I do French with granddaughter because French is one of her things. And so different topics I'll do depending. Gardening, I tend to take out whatever I feel like thinking about at the time. And so I've incorporated into life. I don't put aside time for it.
Very good. Well, let's talk about characters. Now, this is rattling around in my head still. Is there a difference between the bears and your rapscallions, or
No.
how? Yeah, let's parse that out.
The bears are rapscallions. I just introduced them in the book before I started the bigger topic of rapscallions.
Right.
Indigenous cultures use characters in order to tell stories, to bring abstract concepts and all other concepts to life and give them character. Memory champions do exactly the same. Cards have character. I use the Dominic system for numbers, so all my numbers, pairs of numbers are characters, because you can make stories that are vivid, unfortunately violent or vulgar, which works even better, right. But you can bring abstract concepts to life. So the ancient Greeks had Grammatica, who was a character that brought all the grammar rules to life. So I started thinking about this and looking at Indigenous and Aboriginal ancestors, and the Pueblo call them Kachina, and they have about 250 characters who play out the stories in their life. When we started testing this in primary schools, I'm talking about Paul Allen and other educators, but he's the art teacher that I worked with in schools, we didn't want to use the term ancestors or Kachina or anything else that was a misappropriation of another culture. So we looked up words to call them. We decided that we wanted to give them lots of characters, so we called them cheekies, except we then Googled that, and you get a lot of bottoms. So we decided that wasn't appropriate. Right. Paul ended up coining the term rapscallions. So it's a word that is a ratty little character, but that gave them characters. So the students started making these characters. and using them for all sorts of things. But I'll talk about the bears. For French, I have Fleur and Petit Professeur, who's a big female bear and a little male bear, and I associate them with the feminine and masculine
Right.
words. So when we're cooking, anything for feminine, Fleur holds on to, and anything with masculine, Petit Prof does, which means that I've got these images of these objects with the particular bear, which gives me the feminine, masculine. I use Dominic O'Brien's ideas of gender zones. So fruit, if I associate with the fruit shop, it's feminine. With the supermarket, it's masculine. But I also talk to the bears. And this is what I've found with a lot of the language stuff is you learn a lot of vocab, but putting it together didn't work. So I chat away to my bears all the time,
Right.
which means I have to keep looking up the verbs and the grammar and the sentences in order to have these conversations. And they don't mind that the conversations are continually repetitive.
Right.
Petit Prof doesn't like the fact that he has to hold the bra every morning, because bra in French is masculine, the
Right.
soutien-gorge. He doesn't like the idea vagina is also masculine.
Mm.
So, and we talk about Damien as he goes past, which gives me he, she, them, they, whatever.
Right.
And so by having these conversations with these characters, I'm actually thinking more about language.
Yep.
And then we can go further into this concept of ancestors, people that Indigenous cultures learn from, not just about.
Right.
And I decided that my own ancestors, I know names back a couple of generations, I don't know much more. So I created a list of 130, because that's a deck of ordinary cards plus a deck of tarot cards, because I use the cards to associate them. 130 characters that I chose from history across the different disciplines, and started putting them into my memory palaces and into my life. And that has had a huge impact.
Well, in some sense, I feel so vindicated reading your book, because I've been told I'm crazy for some of these things that I've been doing slightly similar approaches. Like, he's not really an ancestor, but that's E.T., all right?
Yep.
And I follow E.T. all over the place, and he's very good for Chinese. That's E-U-N, little YouTube symbol there, for hospital. And I don't know the extent to which you follow around individual characters through a memory palace, but I think of them as bridging figures. And so E.T. can be used again and again and again, and we have conversations about whatever he might be involved in Chinese vocabulary.
Exactly, and that's a rapscallion. You're using a character in order to bring it to life. So some of them are ancestors, but I also have a whole swag of other characters that will come with me and I will talk with.
Right.
Sometimes it gets to the stage my brain can't cope anymore. I just want to go down the street and just walk. And I have to tell all my characters and landscape to please shut up. St. Augustine won't. He refuses. He jumps out from his lamppost every time without fail. And I wonder whether it's because the quote he said about his memory palaces and how he would take that they'd come to life and he'd just take what he wanted from each one. And he wrote beautifully about it. Whether that's why he insists on being part of absolutely everything. It's interesting how much these characters do come to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of bringing them to life, you're quite an accomplished artist. I mean, there's some incredible insets here that, amaze me, because I admire art very much. Tell us about that and the role that it plays in helping you create these figures that you use in your memory tools, and then also just helping you remember more information.
You're the first person to ever say I'm an accomplished artist. I much appreciate it. Because from the medieval times, I started going into the early literate times. In medieval times, art was a critical way of memory because there weren't a lot of books. And so they would use the church windows, memory palace and everything. But they also used art as memory aids that was taught in all the schools. So, yes, what you've been looking at is my visual alphabet, which I've got and the whole visual alphabet is actually in the book, but the bestiary isn't. I'll talk about that in a moment. So peg lists, one sun, two shoe, three tree, doesn't have enough character for me.
Right.
And in the medieval times, they also linked them. So I've got A as arachne. I've got the alphabet, the 26, and there's a lot of medieval writers talked about using visual alphabets. And so A is arachne, and she's throwing her web over B the bird. I'm just getting it back for you. Over B the bird, who's being attacked by the cat, who's being burnt by the dragon, who's burning the eagle, who's attacking the frog, and so on right through. My favourite's the skull. Once we get to R, we've got a rat sitting on a skull. So you've got a continuous set of images, and for some reason the brain can do images separate to words at the same time without interfering. So when I'm giving public speaking, I've got each of these characters interacting with whatever I'm trying to talk about. So I open a lot of talks with Google. Why on earth, why people say in the age of Google, why do you need to memorize?
Right.
Well, you do if you don't want your brain to die, and Google focuses right down and doesn't give you that big picture, which you'll be finding the same as me. You start to see links that you wouldn't have considered. Right. So my starting character is Arachne throwing her web over the bird. Well, in that, when I'm using it for that, she's throwing a net, the internet, over the bird. So I make that link, and then I've got those interactions happening in my brain and giving me the whole speech. So the visual alphabet is hugely useful. I use it all the time when we're out birding. I use it for my bird list on the way. And I decided to use it for names. But if I meet Mary, I've got M, my little marmoset, but also Martin and hundreds of others. And the J's, M's and R's in particular are a problem. So I went on then and did a bestiary. I'll just show you a little bit of it there. And this is going to be published as an ebook within a few days and as a print book within a few weeks. And the bestiary is every first two letters that could start names.
Right.
So for Mary, I've got the macaw, and macaws have a lot of markings around their eyes. So when I meet someone, I associate them with that animal. I'm not saying every Mary is a macaw. I'm saying that that's a feature to focus on. Right. Because I tried the methods of thinking of somebody who also has that name and lots of other methods, but my brain doesn't work that fast. It works very slowly. It's good at logic, but it's lousy at speed and memory. So I have an animal. As soon as I meet someone, I know what animal I'm using, giving me the first two letters. So CH, chipmunk. If I meet a Charles, that's my default. If it's a little chipmunk, it's Charlie. If it's a big chipmunk, it's Charles. But if I then meet Christian, the chipmunk's wearing a little cross.
Right.
And so I can add to that. The problem when you meet people is that you start the conversation straight away. So now I stop the conversation. I say, I'm really bad at remembering names, and so I've got this system. I associate you with an animal. Hillary's are a problem because you've got to say I'm associating you with a hippopotamus, and some of them think, oh, do you think I'm fat? So you've got to make sure you say, I've got some kind of, and I'll say something like, hippos are really dangerous creatures. Are you dangerous? Yeah. Make a joke, people talk about their animal, make a joke, and then you go on. So you've indicated that their name is important to you. You've slowed down and made the association. Then for the rest of the conversation, I've got this hippo attacking and all sorts of things
right
in the back of my mind. I've found it a much more successful system. And so I had to paint the whole 77 paintings, which has taken me a long time. But it's worked for me.
So you had to paint them. This brings to memory something I saw recently about aphantasia that you mentioned, or aphantasia. Did you have to, because of that, you needed to paint them in order for the tools to be usable, or
Now, I find with other people using this, I've given the full list in the book, they're just sketching them roughly. A lot of people will generate an image in their mind. I happen to have a Fantasia where I don't generate any pictures in my mind. I only found out about this months after I'd finished writing Memory Code. I didn't realize everybody else actually really does see these images.
Well, that's alleged. I'm not sure I believe that, to tell you the truth. I'm a bit of a Fantasia skeptic. I don't see pictures in my mind, and this is a linguistic twist. But in any case,
I've talked to a lot of people, and they do. They can conjure up the image of their parents' face. I can't conjure up my mother or father's face. I can't see it. I can get a concept of it.
right,
So I do have these images, but I can't actually see them in color and clear and everything.
right,
I think the process of drawing them made me engage with the characters. So each of these animals is, in fact, a character now.
right, right.
So DA Dalmatian at the top there has a lot of spots. So I don't think people need to go to the extent of going to art classes and painting and creating a book. A quick sketch, and for some people just reading the words is enough. For me, doing it was partly that I got hooked on it and wanted to understand more about medieval art.
Right.
Because there's a lot more in the way they design their pages and everything that aids memory that's really useful if you're studying. So do you want to sidetrack into that now?
Well, just to close on this, I've always thought that it must be a distraction to see images in one's mind when you're trying to create, quote unquote, these mnemonic images, right? To make associations. So if you're memorizing a deck of cards, if you're memorizing someone's name, Mary, or whatever the case may be, I've always wondered at this whole idea that people are seeing images in their mind as being a distraction, because I'm very much on the auditory, logical, or semantic. I like meaning to things, and so it surprised me when this whole idea of aphantasia even appeared on the scene, as being a thing that people thought was a disease or a condition or a problem. Obviously, it isn't, because you have great standing in memory competitions, so it can't really be an issue to this extent.
It's a difference.
Sorry?
It's just a difference.
Yeah, but what I'm curious about is, in some of the science that I've seen, they show that the same visual centers light up in individuals who apparently see images in their mind, and those who don't. It's just the same. There's not really any difference there. But to me, I'm more skeptic of the idea that people see pictures in their minds. We use the word image, we use the word picture, but is that really the case? I don't think so. I mean, it's just the way we describe it, and that's different between when I close my eyes and what actually happens in my head. There's no words for what happens in my head. That's part of the point of imagination.
Yeah. Well, I've talked to lots of people about it, and they tell me if I say to them, imagine an apple, they will describe the full apple, whereas I'll only have the concept of an apple.
Right.
If you then ask me to describe the apple, I'll create one without realizing that's not what you meant. I have quizzed a lot of people, and very few don't seem to see these images. The research says about 2%. I think to go very, very fast in memory competition, doing the logical links, which is what I do, probably wouldn't allow me to go anywhere near as fast as the 14, 12 seconds. What are they down to for a deck of cards?
Right.
I couldn't, because I have words. I couldn't think them fast enough, whereas they're just creating flashy images. And
Right.
the documentary that just came out on Netflix, Memory Games, following 5 of the memory champions to competition, is constantly using these flashy images because that's what they're saying they're seeing, whereas I don't see anything like that.
Right. Well, I guess I don't want to sidetrack on it. I find it fascinating, and I guess
so do I.
I guess I'm an image skeptic just because I don't seem to see them myself either. But in any case,
Yes, I want to go into that a lot more now that I've finished this book.
and my passion about it is too that I just hear from so many people, I don't see images, I don't have an imagination, and I'm just like, well, okay, me neither. I mean, they told me I had image deficit disorder when I was in school, but I still managed to learn how to play music. I
Yeah,
still wrote novels. I still wrote poems. I mean, I'm not, you saw my ET. I'm not a great artist, but I still draw. I don't let it stop me, but a lot of people are letting it stop them, and they're creating prisoner narratives that are locking them in a world of shame and suffering. And I'm just like, what is going on here?
that's crazy. I've read that there is an advantage in that people with aphantasia uh, don't suffer from post-traumatic stress and things like that.
Mm,
I can't relive, like when my father died, which was very traumatic. I was incredibly close to him, but I can't relive any of that.
mm,
And so my brain has just recreated, probably false memories, I don't know, of all the good times. And so I can't, my husband will take me on holidays and then I'll have forgotten in a year's time. I can't remember even going. So how much that's a very bad natural memory or how much it's aphantasia, I don't know. But to me, it's an absolute blessing, because if I hadn't had this struggle with memory, I would never have gone down the path in my research that I have and changed my whole life.
right. Well, what would you say is the key thing that has changed if you were to describe the before and the after? What does it boil down to?
Exactly what you were talking about before. I have this world that's alive. Everything seems interesting because I've now got hooks for everything. Because once you've laid down those memory palaces or other methods that I use a lot of other methods as well. Once you've laid down the basic foundation, you can then layer. And that's the difference between ordinary mnemonics like my very earnest man, just show us nature's path for the planets. You can't add anything in. But if you have the planets, I've got them associated to places on my hand, you can start layering information with movement and stories and so on. I can layer information, and if there's any topic comes up that I don't have a palace, I just add a new one. That's the big difference in my life, is I am never bored.
Mm.
There's so much.
Right, right,
And I've always got a palace to ponder or a memory experiment to ponder.
right. Speaking of palaces, are you up for some technical questions? I can't see it in my mind, so that's partly why I want to ask them. But also, I think they're very interesting considerations that you raise.
I may
So,
not do, but I'll try.
well, with reference to certain tips from Dominic O'Brien and to the some of the medieval and Greek texts and other sources, you talk about marking every fifth station
Yep.
and essentially, if I understand it, hanging to the right predominantly, if not completely. This sort of that's how I understood it.
Hanging to the right.
Is there not like an emphasis on every fifth station, and you sort of would start your journey on the right side?
Oh, that just happens to be my history journey. Yes, because
Oh,
I
okay.
back. Uh, a lot of the Greek uh, references recommend marking every fifth and every 10th position. So I always put 5 locations in a room or down a street in order to the next street. So I'll use something. The streets are always every 10th,
Mm,
and every fifth I'll have a bush or something, so that I can jump in 5s and I make sure I never miss any because there's a rhythm to it.
right.
So yes, I do mark every 5. So in the house, every fifth is a window, every 10th is a door, because I do stack 10 in a room now.
Okay.
So yes, I use that. It happens for my history journey, which I walk out the front door, and if I go one direction, I've got prehistory. I start at 4,500 million years ago and trot right through the Cretaceous and back to 1,000 years ago, 1,000 BC at the front gate, 3,000, because I changed from BC years ago to BC. And then I do the history journey. Now, the history journey goes down the street, round the block, but it also comes back and doubles up. So I'll use the right-hand side for going down, the BC bits, and the left-hand side happens to be 1800s back.
Right.
The really interesting things start to happen because all my ancestors are whacked in the history journey as well. So I've got very few women until we hit the 1800s. Then I suddenly, apart from Queens, Joan of Arc, yeah, there's very few women because history didn't record women much. Then I start to get women and I start to have them chatting to each other. So Emmeline Pankhurst, who's over there at 1858, born, women's rights, universal women's suffrage votes. 10 years later, you've got Gertrude Bell. I don't know if you've heard of her, the archaeologist who did a lot of Arabia. A lot of the stuff in the film Lawrence of Arabia is actually her work, not his. He just took credit, or the writers took credit for it. She worked with him and Winston Churchill. Anyway, she was totally opposed to women all getting the vote. And my instant reactions is exactly the same. How can this unbelievably powerful woman in the wars and knowledge of Arabs be opposed? Her argument was that if they are not educated enough to understand the arguments of the politicians, they shouldn't be voting. And it wasn't just women she didn't think should have universal suffrage, it was men as well. Right. And the same argument, so in my brain, they're across opposite sides of the road in my palace, they're arguing across the road, which starts to make me think about these things. And the same argument just came out about the Brexit vote, that in fact the question was too complicated to reduce to a yes-no, and therefore you had a whole lot of people voting on something which they didn't understand the implications, let alone the politicians understanding them. So that's what starts to happen with this lively landscape and characters.
Well, that gets back to the point somewhat of meditating on the content that you have. And one of the points you bring up is that, at least in the medieval world, it wasn't just that you would be a person of intellect for using these techniques, but also someone with, you'd be considered to have greater moral standing related to memory. So maybe say a bit more about that, because it seems very pertinent to, working through something like an issue like Brexit or politics.
Well, the medieval bestiaries originally, with all their pictures of beasts, were lessons on morality, morals and vices and virtues and things, which is why I changed it to names, because, and any words, you can use it for anything like that, because virtues and vices aren't really of huge interest to me. But you do start thinking about ethics a lot, because I've got all these different characters, like when you get Oscar Wilde, who's just across the road here, a gay genius who was, we lost so much because of that ethical stand. And yet here I am talking about Augustine, who I admire in so many ways, but he would have condemned Oscar Wilde. Yeah. Right. So I start playing with all these characters and putting them together. And it's amazing. I've got Joan of Arc at the same point as Mehmed the Conqueror. So I've got these two characters who are both fighting for what they believe in, and what they believe in is so different at exactly the same time. That's what's happening a lot, is I start considering the moral and ethic, and almost every story ends up with some kind of ethical thing. And if you look back at Indigenous stories, they'll encode the information about the local mountains or where to get water or whatever, but there'll be an ethical side to that story as well. That seems to be what the brain does. As soon as you bring characters in, which may come to life, you're then bringing morals in. So I have some pretty horrible people in my palaces as well, right, because that just brings it to life even more.
So what do you think is in store for us in the future? It seems like people like yourself and myself are fighting the good fight to keep this tradition going, and ideally so that people still reason in their minds and with the true benefit of history. Are you optimistic, or how do you feel at this present moment where we're being pushed more and more to just have smaller and smaller screens that have information pushed at us based on agendas, as opposed to anything that would encourage us to weigh and measure and understand what we're voting on?
I'm extremely concerned about that for two reasons. One is looking at youth and education, and that should go right through life. And the other is looking at aging, because let's start with aging. The research is very strong that we can keep laying down neural pathways, and there is evidence of 100-year-old people laying down neural pathways. But like exercising any muscle, you have to keep exercising it. And there's so much emphasis on physical exercise and almost zero on mental exercise. And if they do it Sudoku or something that's very repetitive, why not spend your life laying down useful information, and including identity? And song is one method that's the research on people with dementia that are almost unresponsive. And there's a whole lot of dementias, but we won't go into all that stuff, that play music from their youth and they will respond even though they're not responding, or place. And those seem to be the two things that are right deep in the brain that are some of the least to go. So why aren't we encoding our information in song and physical items and the landscape, rather than singing through our life about I love you, I can't live without you, and all the pop tunes that get hooked in your head.
Right.
We had a little experiment at Malmesbury Primary School. They'd all done force and force in science. A week later, the kids, I've got 70 kids there to experiment with from prep to year 6. I quizzed everyone saying, you did force. Do you remember doing force in science? Yes. So I put it in context. What is a force? 3 out of 70 told me it was a push or a pull. The rest told me it was when your parents make you do something you don't want. And most of them said, may the force be with you. Appalling physics. So the music teacher, Joseph Bromley, got the Imperial March and did a little song where a force is a push or a pull, and I'm doing the actions because you can't do it without them. The kids sung it in music for 20 minutes or something. In assembly, not again. A week later, I did exactly the same wording and got 70 out of 70 saying push or pull. Up till then, the teachers had been building, every time they said force, the kids were thinking of all sorts of things, not the physics, the science, push or pull. So by using song, we were using art methods for mathematical tables. By putting down your concepts using what the brain does naturally, music, art, story, place, we can then build in education layer upon layer. So we set up memory palaces in primary school and secondary school and use them for a whole lot of things, layered upon them, more than one topic. Why are we not doing this in schools? We don't have to change the curriculum at all. It's just enhancing it. Why not right through life and taking these into old age? Because I am convinced that people not exercising their brains, not constantly reinforcing those neural pathways, we will be increasing the lack of memory and aging and possibly dementia. And the research is getting pretty robust on that.
Right. Yeah, it's kind of a mystery, and I get asked all the time, why isn't this taught in schools? And usually my response is, and I'd love to know if you think this is a good response or not, is just like, why aren't you learning it yourself and teaching it to your kids? Because we can't rely on, or so far, if history is any teacher, we can't really rely on the state to necessarily do what we think should be done in schools, or we have to become the educational reformers ourselves. But then again, wouldn't the place to start be at home? So, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree. If kids start turning up at school with an advantage and they will tell their teachers, I'm using a memory palace, the teachers will listen.
Right.
But I've got 40 years in the classroom, so I've got street cred as a teacher. Wish I'd known a lot more about this back then. I did use stories and funny things, especially teaching electricity and stuff, because I taught physics and maths and that, but nowhere near to the extent that I would if I knew about it now. So I'd like to get out into teacher conferences and so on. I'm really hoping this book is being reviewed in a number of educational journals that are really excited by it. I think the movement's going to come from both ways, but absolutely. Parents playing around with it with their kids. It's good fun. I haven't got one here. One of the examples in the book is a winter count, a physical device. You can use lots of physical devices, memory palaces, miniature. That's my spider family, and I've got lots of others. But one we've used is a winter count for life. The Lakota people in Native American put one symbol for each year and would record their whole history in a cycle going out on a hide or something. Lone Dog's winter count's the best known. So we've started doing this for people in workshops for their own lives. And it's really interesting what happened. Alice Steele, who's one that's been working with this, has a little boy who's 4. And you know how Grandma tells the same story over and over, and kids say, I've heard that one. He likes pointing to the winter count and telling the story. That's when he was born, that's when this happened, that's when that happened, and that's when Grandma did whatever. It's becoming an heirloom for the family stories. And you can take that as an older person. It's a miniature memory palace if you have to go into care or whatever. So we should be preparing right through life with these identity, because one of the big things with dementia is the loss of identity. So there's a whole lot of techniques. Start in school, right through life. You and I need to change the world.
Well, so far, so good, I think. Maybe just to bring it all together, we've talked about memory as a science. We've certainly talked about it as an art with your great renderings. Why is it a craft?
Craft is just practical. There's a lot of theory about memory. Craft are the practical methods, and that's why I think there's about 30 or 31 different actual techniques. It's a craft, and you can make things like my La Casa for the birds, where I've just stuck beads on a bit of wood. The unbelievably effective way of memorising field guide to the birds. These are practical, and that's why it's a craft. And I think that if people think only of memory competitions, they think it's for an elite few who are naturally really good memory. And the research shows that they're not naturally, they're trained. As a craft for everyone, because it is practical methods that can be used by everyone.
I absolutely agree. And I think that point about training is key, because it is exactly the case that if you would just train yourself, you can do it. And that is why I love this book so much, because it gives multiple options, a number of different techniques for doing it, and with that emphasis on the practical craft of making it real in everyday life. So really grateful for the conversation and another book from you. What's coming up next? You mentioned a smaller book with the bestiary.
Yes, mostly now I want to consolidate, because I've got so many going, and a lot of like the Tibetan mandalas and the narrative scrolls. I've done them all as sketches, and I want to render them properly, partly to show people, partly to get more depth. Because what I'm finding, and I don't know if you find this too, is as I use different devices, they're interacting. So my bird device will interact with my memory palace, and I'll start finding the characters moving between my cards that are historical. My ancestors are also in my history walk, and they're also associated with countries. It's all interweaving. And I think that's one thing we've gone badly in education, is putting everything in nice little silos. Maths has nothing to do with art, has nothing to do with music. I want to see art and music into the heart of the curriculum, feeding all of it. So I want to really concentrate on exploring these devices more and making smaller books available about them, about individual devices. I don't know, there's just too much to do.
Yes, as individuals, but together we can certainly make things go further and faster. And I certainly appreciate it. And I echo that interweaving. I mean, the more you get into Chinese, if you have a 00 to 99, well, all your tone combinations are covered. I just happen to refer to cards that have those combinations. And, you know, it's just, it never ends, the intertextuality, so to speak, of how these techniques work together. So thank you again for this, and talk to you soon.
Thanks, Anthony. Bye.